Welcome back to Parenting Unpacked. You're here with Dr. Siobhan Kennedy Costantini and Dr. Kristen Summer as we muddle our way through parenthood with evidence, empathy, and common sense. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Parenting Unpacked, folks. I'm here with Siobhan Kennedy Costantini, my co-host, and I am Kristen Summer. We are chatting about a couple of things today. We're covering off good enough parenting and what that means, and tantrums, the well sought after topic. So, Siobhan, why don't you lead into today? Because I think you're the perfect person to talk about good enough parenting, because you did an absolutely beautiful post on this on Instagram the other day that just made my heart happy. So tell me all about it.
Oh, look, I'm here to make your heart happy any day I can. But yeah, the post itself seemed to resonate with a lot of people, which is really great. So the post itself was basically tapping into the idea that we all have shit days, and that so often our little ones aren't given the kind of the grace or the space by society to have rough days. So the post itself, the text on the image was a quote by Rebecca Eanes, and it says, so often children are punished for being human. They're not allowed to have grumpy moods, bad days, disrespectful tones, or bad attitudes. Yet as adults, we have them all the time. So I think this is really, really relevant because kids, at least definitely in North American society, and here as well in Australia, and like just Western society more broadly, there's this expectation almost that children are supposed to be seen and not heard. You're supposed to sit down, be quiet, be happy, not impose any of their emotions on society. And they're there to be looked at and or like poured over going, oh, how cute. And that's pretty much it. So that doesn't leave a lot of room to be a human person. And obviously, one of the many beauties of being human is that we have such nuance, such complexity. So the post itself, in the text and the caption, I go into more detail about how it's really important to stop and think that our kids are people too. And I totally get it. Like, there's no judgment here. It's easy to get caught up in the day-to-day of things, particularly if you're trying to balance work, home life, childcare. When you're rushing from thing to thing, it's easy to add our children to the list of things. But yeah, just kind of putting the reminder out there that thinking about how our children might be experiencing the rush of the day, and how for them, maybe they getting the blue bowl for their cereal right before you need to leave the door is really important. And all these kinds of things. So that's was kind of the crux of the post. Why? Let's get your take on it, Kristen. Why did that speak to you in particular?
Well, I think this is something that we kind of shout from the rooftops on both our platforms. I've built my platform on TikTok on little skits that kind of illustrate, if you wouldn't treat your spouse like this, why would you treat your kid? And it seems like this really revolutionary way of thinking about kids, but it's actually not. It's just that the Western world has really shifted away from what is understanding the true capacity of children and overestimating what they're capable of, while also underestimating what they're capable of. So we spend a lot of time shouting this from the rooftops, and I think that's because we know so much about cognitive development, emotional development, and social development that when we became parents, it was second nature for us to go, all these norms in Western society don't feel right for us, because that's not how a child's brain works. They're not there to be seen but not heard. They're there to be a human. We're there to raise humans who have this huge range of emotional complexity. And so we spend a lot of time trying to draw comparisons. And one of the things I get as a criticism so often on my videos on TikTok, where I do these skits comparing partners to children, is, well, they're a child and you're a parent. You have more respect for a partner. And it's like, you absolutely have more respect and autonomy to give to a partner, but you should have more compassion for a child who has less impulse control, less ability to soothe themselves and regulate their emotions, less understanding of their emotions. So while you should give more autonomy to your partner, absolutely, you should still explain why children can't do things and have that in mind. when you're doing anything with your child. A really good example is actually something that happened last night between me and Sienna, who is my 2-year-old daughter. She was in the bath and the water was still running because she loves getting in the bath as soon as she can. She's just in while there's no water in it. And so the water was running and she loves playing with the water. And I was distracted for a second, like folding towels in the bathroom and putting them away next to her, and realized that there was way too much water in the bath. So I was like, oh crap. And I like turned around and turned the tap off, and she absolutely lost it. And I think a really typical response would be, no, you've had enough water, stop getting upset. But really, when you step into your child's shoes and you think about it, I was playing with the water. I was having such a fun time. And then it was suddenly taken away from me without any warning, without any reasoning. Like, why is it gone? Give it back. And so I immediately checked myself and I was like, I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I should have given you an opportunity to be done with the water. I should have given you warning. So I turned it back on and I was like, we're going to leave it run for another 5 seconds. And then when those 5 seconds are up, we're going to say goodbye and be all done with the water. She immediately stopped crying. She let the water run for 5 seconds. And then I was like, all right, we're done now. Do you want to say goodbye to the water? And she's like, bye, water. And like, I was like, do you want to turn it off or should I? And she asked me to do it because she knows our tap's really hard to turn off. And that was it. We went from this like very potential huge meltdown to nothing at all. And it was because we stopped and checked ourselves. I did the wrong thing by overreacting. She overreacted too, but that's because she's 2. And then we negotiated a way to make it better for both of us. So, but that happens all day, every day between you and your child. It's a dyadic relationship between you and your child. It's a lot of give and take. And I think the only thing that we both, and correct me if I'm wrong, Siobhan, but the only thing we both want parents to really take away from the content that we share is that it's really beneficial for you and your child's relationship to step into your child's point of view, to embody the way that they might be thinking and feeling, understanding that they have less capacity around impulse control and self-regulation, and to see the world through their eyes, see how big those problems are to them rather than to you, who has spent decades more time on this earth with far more brain capacity to handle crappy things. And like, obviously this can be really hard when you're a parent because you already have so many things in your brain. You don't want to have to take on another human's entire brain and perspective too. So it's always a give and take. But yeah, that's my take.
Yeah, no, I think that's perfect. I really loved what you said when like it's about when that you treat your partner with autonomy, but the real focus with the child is compassion. I think that sums up perfectly what we're talking about. And you touched on it towards the end of your point there, which is exactly what I'm always on about, is that try to think about it from our little one's point of view. This isn't always possible. And even sometimes when we do think about it from their point of view, we're like, well, that's stupid. But that doesn't mean it's not something worth engaging in. So a really great kind of metaphor that came up today is that in my family chat, my brother shared that he got stung by a bee recently and that he's pretty sure it's the only time he's ever been stung by a bee. It's like, wasps, plenty of times, never a bee. And I was like, oh my goodness, did it hurt so much? Because I've only been stung by a bee once and I was 7. And in my 7-year-old memory, it hurt so much. And my brother, who is like 36, and my other sister, who said she got stung recently, they're like, nah, it doesn't hurt that bad. But like, I'm sure it hurts a bit. But for an adult perspective, when you have decades, like you say, worth of pain experience and worth of pain management, like distraction strategies, all these things that you know that you can do to manage a situation, the situation itself is not as challenging because you know how to fix it, or at least you know how to deal with it. And I think that that's a perfect example that we can kind of relate to emotions, is that when you're an adult, something that's disappointing or frustrating or upsetting isn't as upsetting because you understand how and why it's happened. You know what you can do to avoid it. You know what you can do to deal with it, or you distract yourself. Our kids don't necessarily have these strategies. These are the things that they will learn to do and learn to develop over the next several decades through our help. And the reason we know how to do these things is because our parents and our loved ones and the people in our lives helped us learn how to do it. So if it's like, if you put yourself in your shoes and you're like, from my perspective, this would be like a 2 on the scale of upsetting. It's probably an 8 for them. And that's because it, like, from their perspective, this is maybe the first time this has happened, or like if they're not, even like with our little ones who are about 2, like there's only so many times they've been disappointed. If we're lucky, it's probably like a dozen, maybe 2 dozen. That's not many times. Whereas in our lifetimes, we've been disappointed or frustrated like thousands of times. So you learn after 1,000, you know how to deal with it.
Yeah, this is absolutely true. And you said something really amazing. It was mind-blowing to me the other day when you said this. And it was like an aha moment, a light bulb moment, whatever you want to call it. And like, I saw it on TikTok. I think it was a story that you then added to TikTok, because let's face it, you live on Instagram, I live on TikTok.
Do, yeah.
We occasionally overlap.
Yeah.
But the thing you said was that for a lot of kids, tantrums have the potential to turn into or feel like panic attacks. And as someone who has experienced panic attacks and whose early motherhood experience was characterized by many panic attacks, this just resonated with me in such a really strong way. Like, I know that tantrums are huge emotions overwhelming the body, but for some reason, I never really connected that those huge emotions are actually going to turn into panic attacks the same way they do for me. And you said something just then that we had, as children, we had lots of adults teach us these regulation skills and ways to cope with things. But that's not entirely true, because a lot of adults make it into adulthood not understanding that emotions will pass, that emotions come and they go. A lot of adults will actually push against those emotions, like me, up until I got a lot of therapy after my postpartum experience. We push against those emotions, and pushing against them and hiding from them and avoiding them makes them grow. It makes them bigger, and it makes them into this thing that becomes a monster that overwhelms you and suffocates you and turns into a panic attack. So understanding how it feels to have panic attacks, I have even more. Like, I already had a lot of appreciation for what my child was going through, but now I have even more, knowing that it's not just like feeling upset, it's the physiological symptoms that come along with that kind of level of emotional distress. And that might be akin more to like a meltdown level tantrum rather than a little tantrum. But it's this massive experience that actually feels really awful, and little kids need our help to navigate through them. So Siobhan, do you want to touch on this and maybe talk about how we can help our kids navigate through these very big panic attack style tantrums?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think yeah, I'm also proud of myself for coming up with that analogy. I think it just came off. I've had lots of conversations with my siblings, as we talked about in previous episodes. I had, like Kristen, I had some really horrific mental health challenges postpartum. And so I had lots of conversations with my siblings who were all incredibly supportive and like there to help me. And so there was lots of, like Kristen has said before, she intellectualizes all these things, and that's how my family processes things as well. So we talked really intensively about the kind of intellectual side of mental health challenges and panic attacks. And I was talking to my sister about panic attacks, and she had experienced one recently for the first time ever, whereas me and my other sister have had them a lot more frequently. And it was amazing. She's like, oh my goodness, I finally understand how all encompassing it is. And I think like that conversation and thinking about that really connected it to like tantrums and meltdowns for me. So before we talk about this a bit more, we should kind of define our terms. So the challenge when it comes to like tantrums and meltdowns is that lots of people think about these words in different ways. So there's no like clinical definition of a tantrum or a meltdown. So maybe we can quickly touch on what we mean when we say these things. So from my perspective, a meltdown is more of a sensory overload, like an emotional overload. It's when it's very clear that our kids are completely out of control. They've been taken over by their emotions. Their frontal cortex is in disarray. It's happening to them and they're just along for the ride. So that's kind of what I think about when I think about a meltdown. When I think about a tantrum, it's almost like, it's really similar, but it's scaled down a bit. It's usually they're a bit more present. It's usually more in response to a specific thing. So they've been thwarted, love that word, where they wanted something and they didn't get it. So lots of people tend to think of that more as naughty behavior, but I think it still ties into this like emotional thing, because as we were saying, they just don't have control or ways of managing their responses. Does that tap into your kind of definitions as well, Kristen?
Yeah, so I agree with all of that, what you said. I tend to define tantrums and meltdowns on the same spectrum. So meltdowns are at the high end of the spectrum and tantrums are at the low end of the spectrum. And tantrums have the capacity, the potential to very quickly evolve into a meltdown, because it's that spiraling of emotion. So meltdown is at the peak. And I know that neurodivergent communities may disagree with this definition, but for our neurotypicals, this is how we are going to define tantrums and meltdowns. It's very much contested, even in the literature, but definitions for the literature and definitions for parents can be a little bit different as well. So when we think about tantrums and meltdowns, rather than keeping them as separate things, I think it's more effective to define them on a spectrum of how extreme is my
intensity almost. Exactly. Intensity is what differentiates them.
Yeah, so we can think about it in terms of like anxiety and panic attacks if you want to. Like a meltdown is the top part of a panic attack. They are gone. It is happening to them. They need lots of co-regulation. They need time. They need support. They need whatever it is that they're asking for in that moment. Whereas a tantrum is like, okay, what's the root cause of it? Do I need to hold a boundary? Do I need to let my child cry and support them through it? Is it somewhere in the middle where I can just sit there with them and sing them a song if they accept that, or just stroke their back if they accept that, or just model breathing? Or, if it's just a little tantrum where something's happened, like they've spilt milk, just saying something like, you didn't expect that. Like, at what point are we in the tantrum to meltdown escalation? And rather than ever seeing it as naughtiness, we should just remove that word from the tantrum meltdown vocabulary, because it is never naughtiness. It is desire for something. It is a desire for control and free will, but we all have that. And we're not naughty as adults if we get frustrated when we don't get something, like a house when we put a bid on it. And then we get sad. No one's like, stop being so naughty. You didn't deserve that house anyways. Like,
yeah,
no, they don't.
The key difference exactly is that as adults, we're practiced in knowing when it's quote unquote socially appropriate to express these feelings. So exactly, we're all different levels, and like some of us have bad days and sometimes we let it out. Whereas kids don't necessarily have that filter. They don't know that when you're at the doctor's office is probably not the best time to just like scream about your desire for a caramello koala. That usually we contain that and then let our feelings out in the car or by the time we get home. They want what they want then and now. And like you say, when it comes to responding to tantrums versus meltdowns, obviously each child is different, each parent is different, each parent-child combination is different. And say like the lower end of a tantrum, sometimes, for example, and all parents will know that it doesn't always work the same way and it's super confusing. So for example, my little one really wanted cake this morning. He gets like banana muffins for breakfast, for first breakfast. And then he had one in his hand and he wanted one. And I said, yes, you've got one. And he's just losing his mind because he wanted one. I'm like, well, that's what's in your hand. I was making the logic mistake. Toddlers not best at logic. And so we fixed it by just saying, yes, you can have more cake once you finish this cake. You have to eat your muffin first. I felt like I was trying to get him to brush his teeth or something. I was like, yes, you can have your cake after you eat your cake. But it was fine. That fixed it. So like, this is the thing, like sometimes fixing what seems to be the quote unquote problem works, but sometimes we need more attuned kind of measures. So one thing that I saw this morning that I really loved, So Kelly from Conscious Confident Parenting on Instagram, she's South African and she's lovely. And she does what's called hand-in-hand parenting. It's a gentle parenting program. But she posted this thing that really spoke to me, and it's talking about how the reason for your child's tears is not as important as the tears themselves. Focusing your loving attention on the tears first gives your child the support and reassurance they need to face and process what caused them. And this is perfect because it's so true. Like, so often as parents, we get really caught up in the solution model. Be like, they're sad, what happened, how do I fix it? When that's not necessarily the best way to do it. Sometimes that works, as I just said, like sometimes it works, but it doesn't always work. And sometimes it's not at all what's needed. So sometimes just focusing on the emotions, because those can be what's scary. Those can be what's overwhelming. In the same way that a panic attack, what's scary and overwhelming in that situation is that our heart is beating out of our chest. We feel so overwhelmed. The world feels like it's about to swallow us whole. At that moment, we're not upset or thinking about what caused the panic attack or what the trigger for the panic attack was. That's not really actually relevant at all because we're past that point. It has nothing to do with that anymore. What's freaking us out and what's overwhelming us is this sense of not feeling safe, this sense of being disconnected from our body, or just feeling so out of control. So often what can help someone who's in a panic attack at that time is, depending on what they need, can be someone giving them a hug and just holding them tight, can be someone sitting next to them and patting their back, can be someone singing or talking to try and distract them. Sometimes it's just time. Sometimes it's sitting in the corner holding your head and waiting, and someone just knowing that someone is there to be there for when you get out of it. And that's sometimes what our kids need when they're having a meltdown.
Absolutely. And I think we can apply this to tantrums. We can apply it to meltdowns. We can apply it to panic attacks. If you're an adult with a panic attack, the thing is that you don't know when it's going to end, and trying to figure out when it ends and trying to pull yourself together to fix it makes it worse. It used to make my panic attacks explode when I tried to pull myself together. It made them far worse. So when we're thinking about our kids, yes, we can go into fix it mode. Yes, there's a bunch of gentle parenting scripts out there. I think Big Little Feelings do really great work, but sometimes their scripts are way too wordy, especially for your toddlers who, when they're in that crisis mode, they can't hear anything. They can only hear their own screams. And if you've ever cried that hard, it's terrifying. You can't breathe enough. You can't listen to anything. Oh, you feel tired afterwards. You feel sick. They're so uncontrollable, and every kid's going to respond differently and is going to need something different. One of the number one questions people ask me on my lives is, when my child is having a tantrum or is upset, they won't let me touch them. Do they not have a secure attachment? And my response is, there's nothing wrong with your child not wanting to be touched. Every child is different. Every adult is different. We are all humans. Lots of children don't want to be touched because that's more sensory input when they are already sensory overwhelmed. They need something constant. They need to hear something that will, I don't know how to describe it. It's like almost like a metronome might help, because it gives something to focus on.
Something to give a beat or a rhythm to tap them back into things.
Yeah, and they might hate that, but I think you can try a bunch of different techniques to see what works for your individual child. Like something that shortcuts my child's tantrums is a calm corner. And I don't have a big house, so my calm corner isn't actually a real corner. It's a basket of fidget toys. And those fidget toys are magical, and I don't know why. It's just that she really enjoys them. They're all different sensory textures. They do different functions. They're like the $3 toys you get from the pop-up stores in the middle of shopping centers. And they're what works for my child. In the middle of the night, while I was night weaning her the other night, when she was at the peak of this emotional distress, because I'm changing such a big thing about her life, because she's always been fed to sleep in the middle of the night. She was so upset, and reasonably so. Halfway through, she started going, calm corner, calm corner. So I took her downstairs, and that context shift, so moving her into a different environment, which works really well for kids too. Like, you can move them outside. Outside is magical for short-cutting tantrums, but it doesn't always work because you have to move a child. Moving her downstairs, turning the light on, and playing with those calm corner toys for just 10 minutes solved almost everything. She calmed down, she felt better, and we eventually got her to sleep quite quickly because she was calmed down. She was at that point where I was actually worried because she was crying for so long that she might vomit, because when you get that upset, you can vomit. If you've ever been a kid and cried for a long time, you feel like you're going to vomit. And so, yeah, for my child, she doesn't like to be touched until she wants it, and she has to come to me. And then the calm corner worked really well at shortcutting and giving her something to focus on. And it was slipping her into her observing mind and out of her thinking mind. So one of the biggest things I learned in therapy was that there is an observing mind and a thinking mind. And we spend all of our day in our thinking mind, but we have 80% negative thoughts every day, all day. And being in your thinking mind all day, where it's mostly negative, is going to lead you to more negative thoughts, more negative feelings. It's going to physiologically affect you. So what we need to do is practice moving into the observing mind, even if it's just for 5 minutes a day, because it centers you, it calms you down, it kind of resets your thinking.
It's almost like a meditative state. It's like mindfulness.
It is mindfulness. It's exactly what it is. So one thing I focus on with my daughter, who is highly sensitive, is making sure she's stepping into her observing mind. And I think they do that when they play. I think kids spend a lot more time in their observing mind and their thinking mind than adults do. But I make sure to push her into that observing mind by getting her to play with sensory toys, to do sensory play. I've always said that sensory play is mindfulness for children, because you can get them to focus on how things feel, how they smell, how they taste, how they sound. Because your observing mind is all about focusing on your senses and the world around you. It's pulling away from all those negative thoughts and listening and hearing and processing all of those sensory experiences. So for my daughter, one way to shortcut those really intense emotions to help her kind of shift her mind frame when it's really hard to get her out of it is sensory things, and it's not touching and cuddling. And she hates it when I sing when she's in the middle of a meltdown. That's too much
funny
input. Yeah,
sorry, I only mean funny. Well, firstly, it's funny for two reasons. One, you have a beautiful voice. At number two, I was gonna tap into what works for my child. It's singing. Yeah, how interesting. And like, this is a perfect example of how different things work for different kids. So Timo, when he's losing it, I just start singing. So we sing to sleep. That's when he's done for the night, he hops on my lap and says cuddle song, and then requests whichever song he wants. It's quite hilarious to watch, because he'll literally go from spinning in circles and running at the wall to, like, I know it's nuts. Like, you know how kids have calm down time or like wind down time before bed? Not my child. He has wind up time and then crash. So yes. But yeah, singing is what works. So the other day he was losing it, like typical, hands down by his side, like head up at the roof screaming. And we'd tried so many different things, and I just started singing, mostly to calm myself down. So there's so much evidence in the literature to show that singing and humming helps regulate vagal tone. So the vagus nerve runs along all through your body. It's a really great regulator of the stress response. So singing and humming help regulate that stress response. Just one of the reasons like Buddhist monks do humming. And it's why in so many different cultures there's humming or singing, because it's shown to be really meditative. And it works for some people and not others. Obviously doesn't work for Sienna. Works really well for Timo. But like, usually not to begin with. Usually he goes, no singing. And I just keep going. And then slowly but surely he comes back down. But yeah, it works sometimes and not others, and for some kids and not others.
Yeah, and I think these are really one thing that people don't know. What happens all the time on TikTok? Parents like parent advice pages are always like, children aren't capable of self-soothing. They need help. You must co-regulate. And then they don't tell parents what co-regulation is. Co-regulation is you regulating your body beside your child. It is modeling, demonstrating what it looks like to regulate your body. And your child can do that too. Sometimes, I think the best one and the easiest one for everyone to understand is rocking. When you are holding your child and rocking, you might think that you're doing it for your baby to keep them calm and you're doing it intuitively. but you're actually doing it for yourself as well. When your baby is crying or when you're trying to put them to sleep, you're trying to calm your body down as much as theirs. Because one thing that we know from the science is that infant mother cortisol levels mirror each other. So from the first moment that your baby is conceived and then in your arms, those stress, so cortisol is stress, those stress hormones are a mirror of each other. So if you're stressed, baby's stressed. And if baby's stressed, you're stressed. So we are forever co-regulating, and we're doing it intuitively and naturally by rocking. Rocking is the first thing that you do by demonstrating co-regulation.
Rocking, shushing, humming, all these things that we naturally do. And even people who aren't mothers, like how many times do you see an uncle or a neighbor or someone hold the baby and do exactly the same things? They're the kinds of behaviors that are so deeply rooted in our evolution and in our history.
Mm-hmm. And because mothers and infants have cortisol synchrony, it's called, when you're having a really hard day with your baby and you just can't get them to calm down, and your husband walks in the door from work and takes the baby and all of a sudden the baby's just stopped crying, it's because that cortisol synchrony is being disrupted. Dad's really calm. So dad's responding to baby in tiny little ways that are a little bit different. And sometimes you need that support. Sometimes it's so hard to calm yourself down that you need someone to step in. And that's why there's all this advice to say, if you're feeling out of control, put your baby in a safe place, like in the cot, and walk away for a minute. It is better for them to cry for a couple of minutes than for you to continue with your body building this stress. Yeah, definitely.
And I think that's so beautiful. And so the post that I just quoted and talked about, Kelly from Conscious Confident Parenting, her post goes on to talk about co-regulation. And it's so funny that you said that no one says what co-regulation is, because when I read this post this morning, that was my exact thought, because she does. And I was like, amazing, someone's finally explaining it. Because so like you say, all these posts are going, you need to co-regulate, you need to co-regulate. It's like, cool, how do I do that? So it's a multi-slide post that Kelly's put up. And the one that she's got that I think points to this so beautifully is what children need most of all in difficult moments is our caring presence. Their brain translates it into the safety it needs to offload their emotional hurt. This is co-regulation. So I think this perfectly sums up this idea that when our kids are so overwhelmed and so in pain, when they're in emotional pain, what they need is our caring presence. They just need us to be there, to be calm, and to be open-armed, whether that's physically open and hugging, if that's what they need, whether it's just the openness of our presence. So sitting there next to them, ready for when they need us. Our calm presence, our calm body helps their brain recognize that this is a safe place, that this is a place that it's okay to feel these big feelings, and it's a safe place to slowly come down from these big feelings. So co-regulation is us being regulated in order to help them learn to self-regulate.
And I'm going to bring in the social learning theorist in me here, which is my expertise. Children learn from you, okay? Everything that they do in these first years of life, I mean, you're a social learning theorist too, you do the newborn part, but anyway, everything that they do in these first years of life is observing how you respond to things. So if you respond to your child's big emotions with calm, they're going to learn that these emotions are okay. They're safe. Having them isn't something to fear. But if you respond to their big emotions with drama and stress and panic, they're going to fear these emotions. And that's terrifying. And one of the things that people always criticize about the co-regulation idea, because it's always used to say that kids can't self-soothe, it's not a skill to be learned quickly, it happens over time, which is true. People are always like, well, if you are constantly doing it for your kids, they're never going to learn. And it's not that at all. So with co-regulation, you are modeling how to calm your body, which means that they are using social learning to observe and imitate that co-regulation ability. So it's just their regulation skills. So you're showing them how to regulate so that they learn by doing, by watching those regulation skills. So it's basic social learning, basic skills of watching and copying. So co-regulation is required alongside the development of the prefrontal cortex, because the prefrontal cortex is in charge of self-regulation. So those two things in tandem will help children develop the skills and coping mechanisms required to deal with big emotions, while you're there showing them a calm presence to normalize the fact that emotions are okay and they're nothing to be feared, while the brain is developing its capacity and its kind of fuse for more self-regulation abilities. So as the brain grows and develops, think about it the same way as getting a little bit more of a fuse on a bomb, right? The bomb is the tantrum, and the fuse is how many things can shorten that fuse before it gets triggered and explodes. So as the brain grows, your fuse grows too. And every time you have a hard moment in the day and don't get a chance to calm back down, your fuse shortens until you end up at this point where it just explodes. So yeah, the brain is growing, so is that fuse. And along the way, as the brain grows, we are showing them different ways for regulating the body. So that's why co-regulation is important, and it's done by doing it yourself. And if you want to model co-regulation skills, you can be a little bit more exaggerated in how you do it. You can show them that you are breathing, and you can narrate it if you want, especially for bigger kids. You can narrate, I'm going to take 10 deep breaths. I'm going to breathe in for 5 through my nose and breathe out for 10. I'm going to do this to help my body calm down, and then do it. And these things help our children understand and have coping mechanisms for managing these big emotions that can be so scary that adults don't know how to deal with them. Like I did. I got to 28. We didn't talk about this in my childhood. We didn't have this language. We had a lot of stigma. No one really knew how to deal with this, and it wasn't educated to parents. So we got,
and like society had a problem with this, right? Like I think back to my childhood, and I can only imagine my parents' childhood. Like it's only in the last, and I was having this same conversation with the parents in my workshops, that the idea of like child mental health is pretty new. The fact that this is openly spoken about in the mainstream, that kids have feelings apart from happy and sad, that kids experience anxiety, that kids experience stress. These are all newish ideas. So like, yeah, this isn't judgment on our parents per se. Like they didn't have the language, they didn't have the understanding. It didn't exist, not in any kind of mainstream capacity. Like sure, there were kids who had like anxiety disorders, but usually those were the kinds of kids that were so in such distress that they were hospitalized, like not the day-to-day anxieties and stress that people face. So we're all learning together, and we want to be part of that journey and that conversation because we think it's important, and we think you all benefit from knowing and hearing about this stuff.
Absolutely. And one piece of science that I'll bring in here, because it seems really topical. So back when we were kids, people just thought that there was happy and sad experiences for children. And this is really ironic because the science actually shows that children can only differentiate between positive and negative emotions in those first years of life. And it takes them a long time to identify the more nuanced emotions within the positive and negative categories. So especially the negative ones. This is
Dr. Nicole Nelson's work?
Amongst others. I gave a lecture on on this section at some point. I can't remember when, sometime this semester. And one of the studies, I think this might have been Russell. It's an author called Russell, so maybe her supervisor. But anyways.
Wendy Russell, yeah. Dr. Nicole Nelson's supervisor, yes.
Yes, I think that's who it was, because she charts out at which ages children can differentiate between which emotions. So for the first 3 years, kids can only differentiate between happy and one negative category. They'll call it sad or angry or fearful. They won't call it all three. They just group all negative emotions together. So if you're asking a child who is under 3 or 4 what they're feeling, they're either going to say one of those words, but they won't tell you which one it is, unless you work really hard with them on it. So for like my child, I'll ask her, did you get a fright or are you hurt when she falls off something? And we've worked a lot on that, so she can identify that. But otherwise, they don't just spontaneously identify different emotions. They can't tell you that. They can just tell you they feel good or bad. It doesn't mean that they don't experience the diversity of emotions. We know they do, but it's not until about 5.5 that they can start identifying sad, angry, fearful, and disgust. No, disgust is a lot either, I think. But yeah, it's not until then that they can start identifying that there are actually different subcategories to negative emotions. Although they experience them themselves, they can't speak it and they can't point to it in a face.
Yeah, emotions are highly complex, and like you say, it's not that they don't feel them, it's that they don't necessarily have the language or the capacity to explain the intricacies of their experience. And as we know, putting language to experience helps refine our understanding of it. Well, that ties us really nicely into our magic and meltdown moments. So I might start with my magic moment, which is a perfect example of what we just talked about. So my little one, every night at the moment, we're playing, it's mostly my husband, and he plays this game where they make a pillow fort, and then all of his stuffed animals have to knock on the door and ask to come into the pillow fort, and he decides who can and can't come in. And the last few nights I have asked, I knock and ask if I can come in, and he says no. And then I pretend to be sad. I go, oh, sad. And I cry and tell him how sad I am. And he laughs and goes, Mummy's sad. And then, And then sometimes he does let me in, and then I go, yeah, yay. And he goes, Mummy, happy. And then I added in, I decided to change my response when he won't let me in. I go, Mummy, cranky. And then he laughs uproariously, Mummy, cranky. And so we just cycle through, and it's his favorite is to make me sad and cranky. So he very rarely lets me into the party. But yeah, it's just really fun and cool to watch him like explore and play with emotion and kind of develop his understanding. And like you, we've done lots and lots of talking about the difference between angry, the difference between scared, the difference between sad. He does not have a consistent or necessarily accurate understanding of it. And there's lots of coaching and prompting that's involved to try and help him differentiate. But it's really cool to see him starting to play around and understand these concepts more.
Yeah, I definitely think we work a lot on fright versus hurt, simply so I can glean
when you hear a scream, what's happened?
Yeah, so, and I think that's different. I don't think that's necessarily identifying emotions. That's identifying, am I physically in pain or am I internally in pain? And she does a really good job of it. I can just ask her now and she'll tell me, because she falls off things all the time. She is dangerous. But anyways, I'm going to give my magic moment because it feeds into my meltdown moment. So I'll just do both in one go. So I am night weaning at the moment. I've made this decision to try and night wean. She's at a good point in her sleep. She only wakes a couple of times, and it's usually early in the morning now. And that's amazing. It's mind blowing for a baby who used to wake 10 times a night. But I fed her back to sleep in the middle of the night and fed her to sleep every night, every day for her entire life. And this is such a big change. So I knew it was going to be hard. I knew she was going to chuck a tantrum because I've tried this before and I just couldn't do it because it was such a big emotion. And so night one was the night before last. And I told her it was going to be a no milk night a few times throughout the day, and told her when we went to bed. So I gave her milk at bedtime because I'm not going to stop feeding her to sleep. I just don't want to feed her back to sleep in the middle of the night to see if we can slowly move away from it. And she was like, yeah, whatever, it's fine. I don't think she really grasped the idea of a no milk night. Or maybe she's just like me in the middle of the night. What we say during the daylight hours don't count. Because she slept for a long time. She slept till 2:30. But she was furious, upset. She didn't understand. She cried for an hour and a half on and off. And I've explained a little bit of this in the podcast already. For 45 minutes straight, she cried until we went down to the calm corner. And she would occasionally remember and ask me again while we were playing with the calm corner toys, Mummy, milk? And I'd be like, sorry, sweetie, it's a no milk night. We're not having milk until the sun comes up. And she would fall apart again. And so it was such a big meltdown over and over again. And it was huge. And I was so sad. And it's not cry it out for anyone that's confused or worried about this. This isn't what cry it out is, because that baby is crying in my arms. I'm holding her. I'm supporting her through it. She's 2. She doesn't need milk at all at night anymore.
And the way her body, just to explain for cry it out, the way our bodies produce stress when in the presence of calm and comfort and reassurance is very different to how we produce stress in the absence of those things. So we're a social species. We need comfort from our caregivers. So when you're holding a baby who's crying, the way they, and this is even newborn infants, the way they produce cortisol is very different than if they're by themselves in a cot crying.
Absolutely. So she was completely comforted and supported, and I was doing everything I could to make her happy. And I was constantly in this internal battle of, do I give in? No, I shouldn't give in, because I'll never be able to do this otherwise. It's going to show her that like no milk night doesn't mean no milk night. But also like, I wish I could give in because it's so sad. In the end, we managed to get her back to sleep after an hour and a half with my husband and I lying either side of her in her bed, which is not uncommon. I bed share with her. It's just my husband's not usually in there too, but she said, need daddy. So daddy came. He hears everything at night. And she let me sing her to sleep, which is, I hum to put her to sleep while I'm feeding her every time, because, you know, multiple sleep associations are apparently a good thing. Not that I've ever been able to get them to work, but yeah, she fell asleep to me singing to her. So that was the meltdown moment, because the magic moment was that last night was night 2 of night weaning, and I didn't have to do anything because she slept through the entire night.
Hey, congratulations.
Yeah, she was so exhausted from night 1 of night weaning that she couldn't be bothered to wake up.
Can't do this again.
Yeah, I'm sure tonight will be rough.
Look, yeah.
But you know, it's not a linear trajectory, but the magic moments and the meltdown moments are all there in one. Yeah. Weaning is hard, but
well, my meltdown is, I mean, it's not really a meltdown, but my less than ideal thing of the week is kind of similar in that we've had to bed share and co-sleep the last 3 nights. So which isn't like, that's not that bad really, but we've had a period of really good sleep recently where there's been either sleeping through or kind of self-settling through the night. Again, my child is almost 2. This is a huge difference than where we were a year ago. Please refer to my postnatal depression episode. That we were in a very different place. But sleep has been good for the last maybe month. But then, and the thing is, like, this has nothing to do with him. It's not even his fault. And even if it was his fault, that's fine. Possums, bloody possums. They have been on the roof and fighting. And we have a tin roof, so they scratch around and hiss, and they just keep waking the whole family up. It's not just him. And then the first few fights and little scuffles, he can kind of doze back to sleep, but there've been some loud ones, and then he just wakes up because he's scared, because there's medium-sized mammals attacking each other on our roof. So yeah, that's hard. And then my husband told me that in the night that he woke up and he went to go to the toilet and watched one of them fling the other off the roof, off the 2-story roof, and just watched it fly into the tree. So yeah, the last 3 nights have been co-sleeping because of possums, and I don't like them. And they're annoying me, and I'm sad.
That is the most Australian meltdown moment I've ever heard. Anyways, folks, if you ever wanted to know where we're recording this from, it's obviously Australia. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode. We have a real fun one coming next week. Happy New Year, by the way. It is the start of January. We hope you enjoyed your silly season. We had lots of fun on our rest from the past. It hasn't been silly season for us yet, but Happy New Year and Christmas to you guys.
We trust that we'll have a wonderful, wonderful break, and that we'll feel rested and rejuvenated, and we're ready for the new year.
With only 532 meltdowns during the Christmas season, because that's what happens to toddlers and adults in the Christmas season. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Bye.